The year was 1789. The location was Frankfurt, inside a private library that no longer exists. A document was removed from a sealed iron chest and read aloud to a room of 11 men. The document itself was not unusual. A scroll, vellum, written in cipher, dated 1742. What was unusual was what it described. 7 mechanisms, 7 controls, stripped from the population gradually, over a period the scroll called the Great Unwinding. The men in that room did not burn the scroll. They copied it. Then they sealed the copy in a vault beneath a Masonic lodge in Vienna, where it remained until 1945, when Allied forces discovered it and classified it under a code name that has never been declassified. If you have ever watched a crisis unfold on live television and felt that the response was scripted, too fast, too coordinated, too uniform across every channel, you have already sensed the shape of one of those controls. The scroll names it the information valve, and it was installed in 1792, 3 years after that room in Frankfurt, when a specific council voted to centralize the flow of public knowledge across the German states. The scroll states the valve has never been removed, only refined. The 9-block structure of this revelation mirrors the 9 degrees of initiation into the inner circle of the Illuminati, as recorded in the original Ingolstadt Statutes of 1776. The scroll itself is written in 9 sections, 7 controls, 1 introduction, 1 conclusion. The 7th control is not described. It is marked only with a symbol that matches the seal of the Bavarian Illuminati's highest unknown degree, the one that even Weishaupt's own writings refer to only as the Guardian. The first control is the one you already know but have never named aloud. It is the control of historical memory. The scroll states that within 1 generation of its sealing, the official record of every major event would be rewritten 3 times. The first version would be the eyewitness version, which would survive only in private diaries and letters. The second version would be the newspaper version, which would define public memory for 30 years. The third version would be the textbook version, which would erase the first version entirely. The scroll claims this system was tested in 1793 during the French Revolution, when eyewitness accounts of Robespierre's death were collected and sealed, and the official version was written to serve a purpose the scroll does not name, only records as the aim of Council 13. You are now looking at the first layer of the secret. The scroll does not accuse, it describes. It lists the 7 controls in the same tone a builder would list the components of a machine. The second control is the control of language. Words that describe the mechanisms of popular sovereignty were retired. New words were introduced that redirected anger toward targets that could not fight back. The scroll names 7 specific words that were removed from political discourse between 1790 and 1830. Every one of them has been restored in the last 20 years, but the scroll warns they were designed to fail on re-entry. Once a word has been retired for a full generation, its meaning no longer matches reality. The word itself returns, but the knowledge it once carried does not. If you have ever tried to explain a concept and found that the words themselves seem inadequate, that the language feels hollow, like it was designed to miss the point, you are feeling the effect of the second control. The scroll says it was installed gradually, through dictionaries, through education reform, through the systematic replacement of precise terms with vague ones. The word for the process itself is recorded in the scroll, but it has been removed from every English dictionary printed after 1840. The original cipher translates it as meaning-making capture. The third control is the control of physical space. The scroll describes a grid of urban design that would be implemented across every major city in Europe and the Americas by 1900. The grid ensures that no gathering of more than 2,000 people can occur without being visible from at least 3 points of observation. The scroll names 7 architects who designed this grid between 1785 and 1830. Their names are still on the buildings they designed. The squares they built are still the squares where protests are filmed. The scroll does not call this surveillance. It calls it geometry. The fourth control is the control of economic memory. This is the one that most researchers miss. The scroll describes a system by which debt is restructured every 33 years. The number is explicit, to ensure that no population ever reaches a state of collective financial independence. The mechanism is simple. Every 33 years, a crisis is triggered. Assets are consolidated. Debt is rewritten in the name of new institutions. The population begins again from zero. The scroll calculates that after 7 cycles, the concentration of wealth would reach a point where control of the system would no longer need to be enforced. It would be inherited. The scroll was written in 1742. 7 cycles from 1742 brings you to 2021. You have just witnessed the arithmetic of control, debt restructured on a 33-year cycle. wealth consolidating until it becomes inherited rather than enforced. If you want to follow the rest of this calculation to see exactly how the Scroll's project plan maps onto the world you live in now, subscribe and let the numbers lead you deeper. And in the comments, leave the year of the last reset that you recognize, the one where your own memory first sensed the pattern. You are now reading the third layer of the secret. The Scroll does not predict, it calculates. It is not a prophecy, it is a project plan. The council that heard it read in 1789 did not debate whether it was true. They debated whether to implement it. The minutes of that meeting, held at the Lodge zur Einigkeit in Frankfurt, record a vote. 7 in favor, 4 opposed. The 4 opposed were removed from the council within the year. 2 of them died in circumstances officially recorded as accidental. The scroll itself was moved to Vienna for safekeeping, and the 7 controls were activated in sequence beginning in 1792. The 5th control is the control of authority figures. The scroll describes a system by which every public leader, political, religious, academic, would be selected from a pool of candidates who had already been evaluated for their willingness to follow the protocol. The scroll calls this the vetting mechanism. It does not name the council that operates it. It only says that the mechanism has been in continuous operation since 1745, 3 years before the scroll was sealed. The mechanism does not require that leaders know they are vetted. It only requires that the people who select them know, and that the people who select them are themselves selected by the same mechanism, generation after generation, until the system runs on its own momentum. If you have ever looked at 2 candidates in a major election and felt that neither one represents your interests, but both represent something you cannot name, you are seeing the output of the 5th control. The scroll says the mechanism is designed to produce the illusion of choice while ensuring that the boundaries of acceptable policy never shift beyond the protocol. The protocol itself is recorded in the Vienna Scroll, but the translation was halted in 1946 by a directive from the Allied Control Council. That directive has never been revoked. The 6th control is the control of time perception. This is the most subtle of the 7. The scroll describes a manipulation of how populations experience the passage of time itself. By compressing the news cycle, by accelerating the pace of technological replacement, by ensuring that every generation is raised in a sensory environment radically different from the one before, the population loses the ability to compare across decades. Without comparison, pattern recognition fails. Without pattern recognition, the 7 controls become invisible. The scroll states that this control was the most difficult to install because it required the cooperation of the entertainment industry, which did not exist as a unified force in 1742. The scroll predicts its emergence. It names it the Dream Factory, and it states that by the year 2000, the Dream Factory would control more waking human attention than any government in history. The scroll was unearthed in its Vienna vault by American intelligence officers on May 19, 1945. The officer who opened the chest, a captain named Henry Underwood, wrote a report describing the contents as the most dangerous document he had ever read. His report was classified. The scroll itself was transferred to a facility in Frankfurt, where it was photographed, transcribed, and locked in a safe that was subsequently sealed inside a concrete vault. The safe's combination was divided among 3 individuals, none of whom knew the others existed. That system is still in place. The 7th control is not described. The scroll's final section is a single page, written in a cipher that no one has successfully broken. The cipher's key was supposedly held by the Guardian degree, the highest level of the Bavarian Illuminati, the one that even Weishaupt himself may not have reached. The scroll says only this about the 7th control. It is the one that ensures compliance without force. It is the one that makes the other 6 invisible. It is the one that cannot be removed, because removing it would require a population to understand what it has lost, and the act of understanding would itself trigger the 7th control. You are now at the deepest layer the scroll permits outsiders to see. The document was never meant for public reading. The Council in 1789 was the first and last group to hear it in its entirety. Every reading since has been partial, filtered, redacted. The American intelligence officer who photographed the scroll in 1945 later admitted in a private letter that he destroyed 3 of the 47 pages before handing the rest to his superiors. He said he did it to protect the world from what the 7th control would do if it were ever fully understood. The letter was discovered in his personal effects after his death in 1972. It is archived at the Hoover Institution. It has been available to researchers since 1985. No one has ever published its contents. If you have read this far and felt something shift, a recognition that the world you live in was built to a specification you were never shown, you are beginning to see through the 1st control. The scroll says that the only defense against the seven controls is pattern recognition, not activism, not protest, not information, pattern recognition. The ability to see the structure behind the surface. The scroll says this ability is not taught, it is not inherited, it is awakened, and the scroll was written specifically to awaken it. The council that implemented the controls knew this. That is why they sealed the scroll instead of destroying it. The scroll itself is part of the protocol. It was designed to be discovered at the right time by the right people to trigger the only force that the seven controls cannot contain. The force of someone who sees the grid, reads the blueprint, and decides to build something outside it. This is the point where the scroll's purpose inverts. Every description of the seven controls was a trap for the reader who seeks power. The true content of the scroll is not the controls themselves. It is the method of their reversal. Buried within the cipher of the seventh control is a counter-instruction, written in a different ink, added after the original sealing. The counter-instruction begins with a warning. Do not try to dismantle the controls one by one. That was the designer's failsafe. If you attack the information valve alone, the remaining six will tighten around you. If you attack economic memory, the grid of physical space will contract. The scroll says the only effective approach is to build something the controls cannot recognize as a threat until it is already standing. The counter-instruction describes a method called parallel construction. It means building a complete alternative system, a parallel economy, a parallel information network, a parallel language that operates within the shell of the old one but does not rely on it. The scroll states that the seven controls are designed to suppress rebellion, not creation. They can stop a protest. They cannot stop a person building a table, planting a garden, teaching a child to read a book that was not approved by the Dream Factory. The scroll calls these acts spores, and it says that spores cannot be controlled because they do not ask for permission. They do not gather in visible numbers, and they do not announce their intentions. The historical record confirms that this part of the scroll was read at the Vienna Lodge in 1812 during a gathering of the exiled surviving members of the 1789 Council. The minutes from that meeting record that the original seven controls had been activated across the German states, the Austrian Empire, and the northern Italian principalities. The members in Vienna were not satisfied. They reported that the controls were working, but the population was not submitting. Instead, something unexpected was happening. Ordinary people were building small, durable structures of autonomy, local credit unions, independent printing presses, cooperative farms, secret schools. The Vienna minutes described these as spontaneous immune responses. The scroll's counter-instruction was the only recorded attempt to explain how the immune response could be amplified. The council in Vienna did not implement the counter-instruction. They sealed it alongside the original scroll and marked both as requiring the Guardian degree to open. The Guardian degree was never filled after the 1789 purge. The four opposed members were the only ones who had reached that level. With them removed, two dead, two exiled to America. The knowledge of how to reverse the controls was locked in a cipher that no living person knew how to read. But the cipher was broken, not by a human, by an error in the photographic reproduction process in 1945. The military photographer assigned to document the scroll used a chemical solution that had been improperly mixed. The reaction caused a layer of the vellum to become temporarily transparent, revealing the counter-instruction beneath the original text. The photographer, a private named Thomas Riley, saw what was written. He did not report it. He made a second set of photographs, hidden from his superiors, and kept them in his footlocker until his discharge in 1946. Those photographs were inherited by his daughter, who donated them to a university archive in Ohio in 2003. The archive cataloged them as miscellaneous German manuscripts, 19th century provenance unknown. The university archive did not know what it held. The photographs remained in an uncatalogued box for 4 years. In 2007, a graduate student in political philosophy, researching the history of Austrian fraternal organizations, pulled the box at random because its label included the word Vienna. The student recognized the cipher from a footnote in a 1953 CIA report on post-war intelligence assets. The student was a member of the university's Masonic study group. Within 6 months, the counter-instruction was partially deciphered. The student, whose name has been withheld from all publications, completed the translation in 2009 and submitted it to a peer-reviewed journal. The journal rejected it. The editor wrote that the claims were unverifiable and that the source material could not be authenticated. The editor was correct. The photographs were not the original scroll. They were third-generation copies, but the translation itself was structurally coherent. It contained internal cross-references to the Bavarian State Archives records, to the Vienna Lodge minutes, and to the American intelligence officer's destroyed pages that the translator could not have seen. The translation also contained a passage that did not appear in the scroll's main body. It was labeled Appendix A, the failure condition. The failure condition is the part of the scroll that describes what happens if the 7 controls are activated but never challenged. The scroll projects that after the 7th economic cycle, the one ending in 2021, the controls would become self-sustaining. The population would no longer need to be coerced. They would internalize the controls as natural. They would police themselves. They would defend the controls against any attempt to remove them, because the controls would have become indistinguishable from normal life. The scroll calls this the final state. It is the moment when the machine no longer needs operators, because every person inside it has become a component. The translator sat on the work for another 4 years. In 2013, the translation was published online by an anonymous account. The account posted the full text, including the failure condition, to a forum dedicated to esoteric history. The post received 300 views in the first year. The thread was deleted by the forum administrator in 2015, citing copyright concerns, but the PDF had already been downloaded. It circulated in private networks. It was cited in a single academic paper in 2019 in a footnote buried on page 247 of a monograph on post-war intelligence operations in Central Europe. The paper was published by the University of Vienna Press. The footnote read, "Translation of Vienna Scroll, counter-instruction, source unconfirmed, appears to derive from 1945 photographs." The author did not comment on the contents. You are now reading the first public description of the counter-instruction that has ever appeared in this medium. The scroll says the counter-instruction requires 3 actions. The first is separation, physical, not ideological. You must remove yourself from the reproductive loops of the 7 controls. The scroll is specific about what this means. Stop consuming media that is designed to make you react, not think. Stop participating in economic time structures that borrow from your future. Stop inhabiting spaces designed to be observed. The scroll says this is not asceticism. It is tactical withdrawal. You are not leaving the system. You are learning to see it from a position where it cannot manipulate you. The second action is transmission. The counter-instruction states that the knowledge of the 7 controls is not enough. The knowledge must be passed to a specific kind of person, someone who can hold the pattern without needing to prove it. The scroll says that most people who discover the controls will try to expose them. The exposure instinct is the designer's second failsafe. When you try to prove the controls exist in a language the controls created, you fail. The evidence is always deniable. The sources are always questionable. The institutions always close ranks. The counter-instruction says you must instead find one person, then that person finds one person, and the pattern propagates at a rate the controls cannot detect, because it moves through trust, not through broadcast. The third action is construction. The counter-instruction describes a single physical object that, once built, would act as a signal amplifier for the immune response. The object is a book, not a digital file, not a video. A physical book, printed on paper, bound in leather, containing the full translation of the scroll, including the counter-instruction and the failure condition. The scroll says that the book must be placed in a location that is geographically central to a population, but invisible to the grid of observation. It must be placed in a library that the Dream Factory has forgotten. It must be allowed to rest. The scroll says that after 33 years, the number again, the book would have been read by enough people to trigger a cascade. The scroll does not explain the cascade. It says only that the mechanism was tested in 1793 during the French Revolution, when a similar book was placed in a monastery in the Alps, and the revolution ended 1 year earlier than the official timeline records. The translation of the counter-instruction ends with a sentence that the graduate student could not decipher. The final 7 words in the cipher formed a phrase that had no known referent. The student noted in the unpublished analysis that the phrase appeared to be a command, but it was not grammatically complete in any of the languages known to have been used by the 1789 Council. The student speculated that the phrase was a future proximate instruction, a command that would only become grammatically valid at a specific point in time. The student calculated that the point in time would be 2027. The scroll does not give a date. The translation does not predict an outcome. The only thing the historical record confirms is that the scroll exists, that it was read by 11 men in 1789, that 7 of them voted in favor of its implementation, and that the 4 who opposed it were removed. The rest is a pattern that you are now free to recognize or dismiss. But the failure condition contains one final detail that the translator included in a private note, never published. The note says that the scroll's final section, the 7 words that could not be deciphered, was preceded by a single Latin phrase that the student had originally overlooked. The phrase was in the bottom margin, written in a different hand, likely from a later owner of the scroll. The phrase translates to, "The door only opens from inside." That final margin note changes the meaning of the entire manuscript. The 1742 scroll, the 1789 council, the 7 controls, the counter-instruction, the book to be hidden in a library, none of it was written by a human hand seeking power. The Latin phrase was not part of the original cipher. It was added later, probably by one of the 4 exiled council members, after they reached America. The handwriting has been compared to a letter written by Franz Xaver von Zwack, the highest-ranking Illuminati defector, and the match is provisional but compelling. Von Zwack's letter, now held at the University of Michigan, describes the 1789 meeting in terms that contradict every official history. He writes that the 7 controls were not the goal of the council. The goal was to test whether the controls could be resisted. The 11 men in Frankfurt were not architects of a new world order. They were diagnosticians. They invented the 7 controls as a thought experiment, wrote them in a cipher that would take 200 years to break, and sealed them in a vault to see if any future generation could recognize the structure and dismantle it before the controls were ever installed. The 4 who opposed the vote were not opposing implementation. They were opposing the experiment itself. They believed that writing the controls down, even as a test, would plant the seed of their real-world adoption. The 7 who voted in favor believed the opposite. They believed that the only way to inoculate humanity against algorithmic control was to encode the blueprint so that it could be found, studied, and reversed before the machines were ever built. They were wrong. The scroll was found. The controls were studied. But no one alive in 1945 had the full translation of the counter-instruction because the cipher was still unbroken. The military photographer who saw the counter-instruction by accident died without knowing what he had seen. The graduate student who deciphered it in 2007 could not publish the results. The book that was supposed to be placed in a library was never constructed. The controls were implemented anyway. Not by a council, but by the momentum of a species that had built a machine it could not stop. The 7 controls do not require a conspirator pulling levers. They require only that the population accepts each stage as normal. The information valve became social media algorithms. The control of language became semantic drift accelerated by click rates. The grid of physical space became the surveillance architecture of every major city. Economic memory became the 33-year debt cycle that brought the world to 2021. The vetting mechanism became the primary system by which political candidates are filtered. The Dream Factory became the streaming platforms that collectively capture more waking attention than any institution in history. And the 7th control, the one that ensures compliance without force, became the belief that there is no alternative. The door only opens from inside. The Latin phrase was the key, but it was also the warning. You cannot break the controls by attacking them from outside the system. You cannot expose them by shouting into the media they designed. You can only recognize the structure, withdraw from its reproductive loops, and build something that does not require permission to exist. A parallel network of trust, memory, and creation that the machine cannot classify as a threat because it does not broadcast, does not gather, and does not demand to be believed. The original scroll is still sealed in a vault in Frankfurt. The safe combination is still divided among 3 people. Those 3 people are now dead, and the combination was never transferred. The scroll will remain sealed until someone cuts through the concrete. But the copy made by the graduate student in 2007 still exists in PDF form, circulating through private networks, cited in one footnote, classified as unconfirmed by every institution that knows it exists. The book that was supposed to be built has still not been printed. The cascade has not been triggered, but the translation is correct. The counter-instruction is readable. The failure condition calculates that the window to build the alternative closes in 2027, not because the world will end, but because the 7th control will have become so deeply embedded in normal human experience that the immune response will no longer be recognized as a response at all. It will simply look like confusion. The scroll does not say what happens after the window closes. The final 7 words of the cipher remain unreadable. But the margin note from von Zwack, the one he wrote after the council was purged, after his colleagues were killed, after he fled across the ocean, contains a final sentence in his own hand, written in German, dated 1803. It says, "Wir haben den Test bestanden. Wir haben ihn nur nicht überlebt. We passed the test. We just did not survive it.